I said something interesting yesterday, which Larry, I don't know if you heard it, you didn't hear it. I don't think you're on. That you have a person, there's the famous quote from Mark Twain. He said, as he gets older, his father gets wiser. It's not when he was younger, he didn't understand what his father said. But to be able to appreciate his father's sage advice, as sage as it was, when a person's younger, he hears it, but yet he doesn't have the capacity to appreciate its value, so therefore he can't apply it and internalize it and assume that perspective, because he doesn't see the necessity of that perspective. But as you get older and you realize life is not as you originally saw it, the lens you saw it through is not the correct lens. As you get older, we have corrective lenses. You have to always change your prescription to accommodate the eye as it changes. Identically, as we get older, our lenses change. We see life differently based on our experiences. And because of that, something that was seen as maybe intelligent, it becomes sage advice. It's sage wisdom. Good, Joe, just one moment. So initially what was understood as maybe intelligent, but to assume it as a necessity of life, and that is the true path one must take and even sacrifice for it because of its innate value, a younger person doesn't have that level of appreciation. But as we get older, due to life's experiences, if you're wise, the wise get wiser, and the fools become more foolish as they get older, because they're not looking for the truth. They're looking so-called for other things other than what it's all about. We have senses, human senses, smell, taste, touch. We see, we hear. Those senses are realities. And there are other senses which are not realities, they're realities, but they're not as tangible as other senses. An example, a person is a well-weathered businessman. When he sees a good deal coming his way, immediately he senses its value and the opportunity that's within the deal. And when he sees another deal, other people may see it as being one of a kind of opportunity. Because of this man's experience, immediately he dismisses it. He would not consider it for a moment. So that's not a tangible sense. That's based on one's experience. You sense certain things. But if you wouldn't have that background experience and be well-weathered, you wouldn't sense it. You would read it and evaluate superficially. But now that you have that sense, because of your experience, you're able to see below the surface and to see the core of what it's all about. As a human being, we sense physical. We don't sense spiritual. God gave us a prescription of life that you're able to take the physical and spiritualize it. And as a result of that, we have appreciations for things which we normally would not have an appreciation for. Understanding God, even though it can be proven to a person that the world is not random. The world was created by a creator. Even everything said and done. So as I always say, therefore what? So you'd say, there's a creator, there's a purpose. What's the purpose? Well, I'll tell you the purpose. You'd say, and who said that's the purpose? Maybe the purpose is something other than that. So to be able, even if you accept that there is a creator and there was a purpose of creation, maybe creation was created for man to live off the fat of the land. for man to advance himself materially, for the sake of empowerment. Maybe life is survival of the fittest. Maybe that's what it's about. So how do we have a sense of what is acceptable and what's rejectionable? What should be rejected? How do we have a sense of that? You can only have a sense of that if you have a level of orientation. But what is that orientation? That orientation is a spiritual orientation. And God gave us 3,500 years ago a mandate, a prescription of life, that if you live within that context of life, you invest your mind, your physical activities, are engaged in certain types of behavior, ultimately, you'll sense many things that the average person doesn't sense. You'll come upon truths that most people don't come upon those truths. And even when you come upon the truths, based on the level of spiritualization and orientation, the question is, to what degree do you internalize those truths? Because we're still physical beings. Physical being, we still have needs. But even though we have needs, but if something has a degree of value and surpasses that physical need, automatically that physical need is put on the back burner. That physical need is shunned. I'll give you an example. Person comes and says, I have a piece of real estate for you. It's a $100 million piece of property. I'll give it to you for $1 million. It's in a lifetime opportunity, but you don't have more than $50,000. Where do you get $1 million from? Well, you know what you'll do? You'll sell everything you have. You borrow to the hilt. You'll take in partners for the sake to do that deal. That means you're giving up everything for that mega deal or mega opportunity to purchase a $100 million piece of property for $1 million. But it's $1 million. You never saw $1 million. Doesn't make a difference. But if that is a reality, you're not going to leave a stone unturned. There's no sacrifice you're not going to make to be able to purchase that $100 million piece of property. But that's only because you appreciate the value of that $100 million piece of property. If a person himself, he lives like a hobo, he lives like a person which doesn't have roof over his head. He doesn't need money. He lives in the street. He's a homeless person. More or less, it's all the same. Is this man going to bother himself? Does he have a degree to appreciate what that value is? It means nothing to him. He has no relevance to it. Because his whole background of understanding what value is, as long as he has his blanket in the street, and when it's cold, he can cover himself up, he's happy, and he gets a cup of coffee and whatever it is, he's happy with it. He doesn't need more than that. He's not going to ruffle his feathers for that. He's not going to sacrifice for that. But a person who has appreciation of what that property is and what the opportunity is and how it can make a difference in his life and other people's lives, there's no sacrifice he's not going to make for that. But what about, I'm going to be indebted, I'm going to be foregoing many things till I'm able to pay it back, until I'm able to sell that property? It's worth it. Because the person has an appreciation of what that opportunity is. A person has to have an appreciation of who God is. You have to have an appreciation that the innate value of a mitzvah, doing his will, is unlimited, and there's nothing comparable to it. But you have to have that level of appreciation. Now, how do you have relevance to that level of appreciation? How do you acquire that appreciation? Firstly, I have to establish fact, and even after you establish fact, who said I'm interested in that? Why should that be a priority? So you have to create an orientation to sense its value, that it should become a priority. But even it's a priority, at what cost is it a priority? It's based on the level of your orientation. It's based on the level of your reverence for God. It's based upon your love for God. Because the way, if you follow God's prescription and you do the positive, negative commandments qualitatively, based on that qualitative investment, that will determine to what degree you're spiritualized, and you have a greater capacity to internalize whatever the innate value may be. The Mesilas Yesharim writes, the Path of the Just, who's same author, Ramchal, that he says that body language is determined by your inner feelings. If a person is committed and is inspired, it will show itself on one's external behavior. You're excited about something, you're committed to something, you can do it with alacrity, you can do it with zeal, you can do it with joy, and you'll do it unceasingly. But where does it begin? It begins with the internal. Because internally you feel a certain way. As a result of that, the external, the body displays that excitement and that zeal and that alacrity. That's how it shows. If a person is joyous, what is joy? If you see a joyous countenance, what does that say? It means the man is happy. Everything shows. What shows the inner shows on the outer. But that shows because the person has an understanding of what that is, an appreciation of what it is. But to what degree do you have it? The Yesod V'Shosha Avoda, which I once mentioned, it was authored in the 1700s by a person which the Vilna Gaon referred to this person as a chassid, devoutly pious, righteous. And he writes over there, it's all based on commentary on tefillah, on prayer. Based on the Zohar, he says, when he says the blessing before he studies Torah, Asher bocha bonu mikol ha'amim, God, you've chosen us among all the nations, v'nosel lanu es Toraso, and you've given us your Torah. Now, who chose us from all the nations? The God Almighty, the King of the universe, the creator of existence. You know, who are we? We're fickle mortals. Vis-a-vis God, we're nothing. And yet God chose us among all the nations to give us what's most dear to him, most precious to him. He gave it to us. How privileged should you feel? He said when he would say this blessing, the level of joy he was consumed with, he could not contain himself. It's like a person, you win the $100 million lottery. Well, let's talk about the $500 million lottery. And you get a call. You're not going to sleep for the next 6 months. And then they got to shake you to come in contact with reality to be able to deposit that ticket. That's how consumed you are with that excitement. You don't have the capacity to internalize and to contain that excitement. That's the way he was excited when he would say that blessing and be touched by it, thinking about it. He would feel like dancing. He would dance out of joy. He couldn't contain himself. When he would hear a Jewish child would be born, a male child, and he'd be circumcised, the level of joy he had. Another soldier has been introduced to God's army, into Tzvay Hashem, another one of God's legions, to do his will. He was ecstatic when we hear a child's born. Mazel tov. Did you hear? Chaim Yankel had a boy. It's his 15th kid. It's his 96th grandchild. Oh, that's some brood. That's some handful. Okay. Mazel tov. I guess I got to send a gift. I mean, that's where it begins and that's where it ends. You know? When he would hear it, it was all in the context of what is the contribution to God's honor, God's glory. But why did he react that way? Why did he respond that way? He had a different orientation. Because he was so mentored and oriented, he was able to internalize the reality of what we believe conceptually. We believe it all. There's nothing more precious than that. We believe it and it's reality. We don't question it. It's immutable. But if it is that, so why are we excited about it? Why do we forego everything for it? Of course, there's us and there's that. But us and that, there's no comparison. because we fully don't get it, so to speak. We don't internalize the reality of what that is. So God gave us a mode of life which gives you that ability to be able to. Give you an example. Supposedly they're working on some kind of pill. Normally, you have to diet to lose weight and be healthy and eat healthy foods. What about physical exercise? You got to exert the body. They want to come up with some kind of medication. When you take the medication, it's like you're going through the actual physical activity. You know, like they have a person who can't go on a treadmill. He's lying on the bed, and they'll do the cardiogram as if he's on a treadmill. It'll rev up the system to such a degree that they'll be able to get an accurate cardiogram as if he's on a treadmill. But he's not on the treadmill. He's not exerting himself to that degree. But artificially, you could rev up the heart to that point at different levels to get a reading on the healthiness, the strength, the muscle, and everything else, the whole system. You're able to do it. But if you don't have that, you got to do it in real time. You got to get on that treadmill. You got to work. You got to walk at a certain pace. And only then do you have that reading. We only have a reading of reality if you experience it, if you sacrifice for it, if you spiritualize yourself, your mind, your arm, your mouth. We say the Shema. We say the blessing. We think Torah thought. We put tefillin on our arm. We refrain from doing many things, and we engage in many positive things. All this is a spiritualization of our physicality, because every aspect of our being is involved in this process. But what about if you do it by rote, or you do it out of fear, or you do it out of reverence, you do it out of love, and the many levels of love, more advanced level. So the physical action is infused with a whole different degree of investment. You're a different person. Not the same person. I once mentioned there was a 3-volume work put out maybe 25 years ago. It was on the Vilna Gaon, 3 volumes. The Vilna Gaon was known as HaGaon, the great Gaon, great Torah sage. And over there's a story mentioned that there was a person, the Vilna Gaon, for 40 years stayed in a limited location in a courtyard in Vilna. And the only people who were admitted into that courtyard were his closest students, to study with him and to pray with him. Outsiders didn't come in. Very select group. Once in a while, people were invited, they could come and pray with him. And this person's grandfather was admitted to Daven Ma'ariv with the Vilna Gaon with his group. And his grandfather was a Talmud Chacham, a Torah scholar. He was an observant man, very observant. And he was present, and he heard the way the Vilna Gaon articulated the words of the Shema. Just the way he said it, slowly, with the intention. And he heard his voice, the way he internalized and what it meant to accept the yoke of heaven upon himself. When his grandfather finished that Ma'ariv, for the rest of his life, he was a different human being. Due to that level of exposure to this entity of holiness, the Vilna Gaon, being a dimension which we can't even relate to, it changed his life. He became a different person. What does that mean? When he said the Shema himself, he heard many people say the Shema. He was impacted differently. All of a sudden now, as he said, he pierced the veil. Those words pierced the veil, and it was able to penetrate into his soul. And because it penetrated his soul and his emotion, all of a sudden now he sees he's at a different level. He has a different level of appreciation, different level of valuation. This is what it's all about. I always say, years ago, people used to speak differently. Years ago, if a person wanted to build a business, become wealthy, it took pretty much a lifetime. There are very few people who are wealthy unless they inherited from previous generation before they were 55, 60, 65 years old. That's what it took to build a business if you were going to succeed. At 65, you built a business. If a person didn't succeed by 65, he's not succeeding. So people used to say here that people were not observant. And they first became observant, or they considered later in life in their upper 60s. And they would say, if I would have known when I was younger, what I know today, I would have been an observant Jew from my youth. If I would have known then what I know today, I would have been observant, and I would have led a different life. That's what people used to speak. I don't know if you remember people speaking this way. There were people who used to say that. If I would have known, I would have lived my life differently. You wanted the truth? It's not true. Because when you're 65 or 68, all your energies, your chemistry is really pretty much has waned. You're basically almost on empty. You're running on empty. You're not charged up. You're not here to burn the candle at both ends. All your chemistry is not flowing in your veins. As a result of that, regardless of what you know, it doesn't touch you the way it touches now when you're 68 years old. So if I would be young and I knew what I knew then, no, it's not true. Because the same sexual drive and the same ambition that you'd have as a young man, you'd have then. And being caught up in your ambition and your ego, believing you'll succeed and have what you want, Judaism takes the back burner. Takes the back burner. What today at 68, what you know, you have a different capacity to be able to appreciate what it is today. Because you don't have all that interference, what you had when you were a young person. It wasn't only because you didn't know. It takes a tremendous amount of willpower and understanding to make a choice and suppress what you really want to do what you're supposed to be doing. And that's the reality. But there's a prescription. There's a code. There's a secret. God says, you study the Torah. It's an antidote. You do the mitzvah. You put it on your hands. The text of the blessing before you do mitzvah, Asher kitshanu b'mitzvosov, mitzivanu. You've sanctified us with your mitzvahs and you've commanded us to put on tefillin, to put on tzitzis, to eat the matzah, to sit in the sukkah, to take the 4 species. You've sanctified us. When we engage in that action, we become sanctified. It consecrates us. We become sanctified. When you become sanctified, you become a different being. As much as we don't realize it, you're impacted because now you have relevance to something which is holiness. That holy, being exposed to holiness, that's part of a spiritualization process. And the more we're there, the more spiritualized we are. And if you do it with a greater degree of sincerity and appreciation, it's even to a greater degree. There's greater absorption. You have different kinds of materials. Some are denser, doesn't absorb so easily. Some are more porous, it absorbs more easily. What determines what your absorption level is? Or what your saturation point is? Many years ago, I was giving a shiur where Larry used to attend that class at Shai Gold's office. And somebody had brought somebody to the shiur first time. And wasn't observant, but he grew up traditionally. So he says to me, this person, but what's it all about? I said, we speak about the portion of the week, but it's a Torah class. So he says, I never went to such a class before. I said, okay, so it's the first time. Maybe you'll appreciate what we're going to discuss. He says, I hope I don't overdose on Torah. That was his comment. I hope I don't overdose on Torah. First time I ever heard that term used. The person overdoses on drugs, God forbid. But on Torah, you overdose on Torah. Okay, but that's what he said. 15 seconds into the class, the guy was out cold. That was his level of capacity. You understand? He didn't. We didn't need an anesthesiologist for this guy. Torah knocked him out. Finished. They had to tap him. They shouldn't snore too loud because he was disturbing the class. So what's that man's capacity? What's his absorption rate? 0. Couldn't even penetrate. Even enough curiosity to be able to listen to what it's all about. But he knows it's Torah. He knows he's a Jew. And he knows the people going are people who are as smart as he is and as bright as he is. Why don't you pay attention? That's what it is. If you're a physical being and you're totally inclined to physicality, and that's first and foremost, and that's your priority in life, although you may hear the words, as they say, it's over your head. It doesn't touch you. You're not touched by it. The key is to be touched. There was a certain person, he came to the Yad Avram maybe 38 years ago. He was an Iraqi Israeli. His father was Iraqi, but he was born in Israel. And he was an officer in the Israeli army. And he was wounded. And he had a metal rod in his leg. He was a young man. He was maybe 30 years old. But he had the profile of a real Sabra. A real Sabra, arrogant. You can't imagine. Like the cactus, you go near it, you get stuck. You go near a porcupine, those needles go into you, you feel it. When you were exposed to this man, if you could say something which was caustic, rather than saying something which was more refined, he said it in a more caustic way. That was his personality. And he worked in one of these stores on Fifth Avenue, these electronic stores, 80% off going out of business sales. Every day you saw in the window on Fifth Avenue. He worked in one of those stores. They sold rebuilt electronics for first class as new. He worked in one of those stores. I'm not sure if he even had a green card when he was working. He was allowed to work. That was he wasn't observant at first, and then afterwards, he started to come. He liked what he heard, and ultimately he became observant. I said something to him, and he said to me, he says, "I want to tell you something. If you would have said what you tell me today, which touched me 3 years ago, I wouldn't have paid attention. It wouldn't touch me at all. Today, for whatever reason, I don't know. Today, when you said it, it touched me. And because it touched me, therefore made a difference. 3 years ago, if you would have said it, I'm telling you, it wouldn't have touched me. Where my head was, where my emotion was, where I was going, I had no interest. I was opposed to what this represented. Today, I'm not as opposed. Maybe that's why it touched me today that wouldn't touch me then. So we see the mindset and what level you're involved and where you are in life. That determines, although I understand what you're saying and I hear what you're saying, does it resonate or doesn't resonate? A number of years ago, more than 15 years ago, there's a certain student of mine. He came from an observant family, went to graduate Yeshiva University. Himself he had an MBA, CPA, and he had a black belt in martial arts. And for whatever reason, he chose to be a non-observant when he was about 21 years old. Walked out the door, gave it up, and he married a girl from a Reform background, Jewish woman, okay? And he started to come to a class of mine for a number of years, and he didn't wear tefillin. And his father was a very observant man. And I said to him, and he had 2 daughters. I said, "Do you wear tefillin?" He says, "No." I said, "Why not?" He said, "Because I don't think it's important." Although he's brought up and he knows, he learned about the importance. So I said, "You realize you have 2 daughters." I said, "Do you want your daughters to marry out?" He says, "No." He doesn't want them to marry out. I said, "But unless you teach them and show them and expose them to something about Judaism, they made a nice person. based on the statistics, they're going to marry out. She says to me, but I take responsibility if they marry out. Yeah. That's his comment. Even if I don't wear tefillin, if they marry out, I take responsibility. I said, you know something? You speak like you have no brains in your head. Children, God forbid, want to commit suicide because of the way you're raising them. I take responsibility. I mean, you bring them into existence. You don't want them to marry out because you see it's a disaster. But by not putting on tefillin, you'll take responsibility for the marrying out. I said, I've never heard such a absurd, stupid comment in my life. You know what happened? He made a commitment. He's going to wear tefillin, no matter what. And there was a story. He was for business in New Mexico, and he realized that he didn't put on tefillin, and it was 2 hours before sundown, and you can't put on tefillin at nighttime. He drove 120 miles to the motel where his tefillin were to make sure to put on those tefillin before sundown. Because this man, his word, once he made a commitment, there's no way he's going to violate that commitment. Today, he's endless, many miles ahead of where he was then. He's not fully observant. He's a person, Rosh Hashanah, although he prays in a conservative temple during the year, Rosh Hashanah, and Yom Kippur, he walks 4 miles to go to an Orthodox synagogue. He will not be in a conservative temple on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur because his core is he knows where he should be. That's the way he is. Contradictions, okay, the contradictions. So he asked me, it was before Yom Kippur, and this person then, he lived in Scarsdale. And he says to me, you know, how would you like to say a class in my house before Yom Kippur speak about Yom Kippur? I said, okay, I'll do it. And he invited his business partner. This person was never observant, conservadox, but he married a girl. His wife was a Beis Yaakov student who went to Beis Yaakov seminary. Could you imagine? She came from a very religious family. And she married her husband. They were quasi-observant, was conservadox, and he was a very wealthy man. This person's partner also, he had other things. He was a very wealthy man. Young person, maybe in his upper 40s. So I give the shir, and it wasn't one of these things you could say, well, it's not on my IQ level. So afterwards, I said it. This woman says, any questions? So she says, I want to tell you something. This girl went to seminary. She says to me, it doesn't resonate with me. You ever hear this word, that comment? It doesn't resonate with her. She went to Beis Yaakov, very orthodox high school, post-high school education, and she tells me it doesn't resonate with you. With her. You got it. If you got $100 bills stuck in your ears and your brain is stuffed with that kind of stuff, there's no room for it to resonate. What kind of arrogant comment is that? The way you grew up, the way you were raised, the way you were educated, that this is the ultimate. Today, it doesn't resonate. Who do you think you are? Because you live in a $2 million house in Westchester, and your husband can write big checks. It doesn't resonate with you. Who do you think you are? There's a story, so you have to have a capacity. Because where she is then, at that point, her absorption, she shut down. She can't absorb it. She has no interest in absorbing it. There was a story, Rabbi Sosalanter. Do you realize Rabbi Sosalanter was in the Kiruv business? And there were times he would travel, live in communities for the sake of bringing Jews back to Judaism. He would travel there. So Rabbi Sosalanter, he lived in Vilna. And Vilna was the stronghold of the Enlightenment movement. And he felt there was a lot of work there. He would lecture, engage in all kinds of intellectual debates to show the authenticity and the truth of Torah. And it's beyond what they think it is. And he had very strong influence on a certain family and brought them back closer to traditional Judaism. And then he took a break for 2 years. He traveled to Paris, Rabbi Salanta, to do kiruv. Paris was a community in the 1800s, totally assimilated. The Jews were assimilated as a result of Napoleon and everything else. They became very assimilated. Of course, they had equality there. Comes back after 2 years, and he meets the family. And the father says to the Rabbi Salanter, he says to him, you know, my daughter just won the competition as the top violinist in Vilna. And she got an award. She's the top violinist in Vilna. And she's 17 years old. I'm very proud of her. He says, good, very nice. So the father goes out. The young girl comes in. We told Rabbi Salanter was a world-renowned sage. He wasn't an ordinary person. And he was known as one of the greatest intellectuals of the generation. And he says to the 17-year-old girl, you know, I heard you won this competition. You're the top violinist in this whole region. Would you play for me a piece? I'd like to hear a piece. So she says to him, he says, and because I want to see how good you are. She says to him, do I have to prove to you how good I am? Everybody knows how good I am. I don't have to prove myself to you. I already won the competition. We're not talking about the arrogance, but that's what she said. If everybody you want me to pay because you want to hear how good I am, I'd have to prove myself to you because everybody knows I'm proven to be the best. Okay. Father comes back in the room, and Rabbi Salanter, he doesn't speak to tell the father how arrogant his daughter was. He says to me, he says, you know, I had a conversation with your daughter, and I asked her to play a piece for me because I wanted to see how good she was, because I heard she's the best in the region. And she says she doesn't have to prove herself to me. In the meantime, when the Rishonim returned after 2 years, he saw the family had some slippage. He slipped back to the enlightenment position. He regressed. So he says to the father, he says, I want to explain you something. The Torah tells us God split the sea, and it closed on the Egyptians. There were 10 plagues in Egypt. So the enlightened woman says, maybe these are all myths. Who said it ever happened? Do you think God has to prove himself to you that he's the creator? Do you think you who are nothing, do you think God has to prove himself to you? If your daughter tells me she doesn't have to prove herself to me because she is that, God is the creator and there's nothing beyond his ability. Does God have to prove himself to you? You don't want to believe, don't believe. God does not have to prove himself to you. That's what he said to this person. This woman says she went to Beis Yaakov, went to post-high school, and Jewish education. Today, she married this wealthy man who's conservative. She has a few bucks in her pocket. It doesn't resonate with me. You hear this? When I heard it, I was nauseated. The level of arrogance doesn't resonate. God forbid, if all of a sudden you get breast cancer, all of a sudden, don't worry, it's not resonating. Don't worry, you can go seek out a blessing from a holy rabbi that you should have a recovery. But right now that you're on top of the world, going wherever you want, doesn't resonate. You got it. So we see everybody has a different capacity based on the station in your life. You can know it's the truth. Does it resonate or doesn't it resonate? So therefore, the capacity to absorb and internalize something, you need that special orientation. You can be intelligent, you can understand, but are you touched by it or not by touched by it? That's not so simple.